This week on A to Z Running, we continue our series on restarting, this time discussing motivation, why it's hard, and what we can do about it.
In the world of running, indoor track season is already exciting with a world record and a notorious yet heralded return.
Also, what's the current status of creatine supplementation?
All this and more on A to Z Running.
Welcome back to A to Z Running, where we help runners thrive with information, inspiration, and coaching services. I'm Andy.
And I am Zach, and you can find out all about our services and what we do at AtoZrunning.com. And you can follow us on Instagram, Spotify, and YouTube so that you miss none of our content. None. Also, you definitely want to be thinking right now about whether coaching services are in your somewhat near future. And the reason you want to be thinking about that is because if you reach out to us, you can find out on AtoZrunning.com/coaching how to do that. If you reach out to us before February 1st, we will offer you 3 months at just about 50% off the current prices. And so you get the first 3 months about half off. And you got to reach out by February 1st in order to get that deal. You don't have to start on February 1st. And that was one of the questions we've received a few times is I want to start like maybe in March, but can I reach out on February 1st? Or I want to start in the middle of February. Or I don't know if I want to start, but I at least want to reach out just in case so that I can get the deal, things like that. Reach out. It will harm you none to reach out. And the goal of this is not to try to coerce you into subscribing to our coaching services. The goal is to gently, nicely coerce you into no, the goal is to provide a little bit of incentive if you were thinking about it, and now is generally a good time to start something like that, because if you're thinking of spring race goals, you should be preparing for them already. And if you're not, that's why you need to reach out to Andy and Zach for coaching services, among other things. Speaking of some of those other things, this is a difficult time of year for a lot of runners, depending on where you are in the world in particular. But in the northern hemisphere, this is a difficult time of the year because the winter weather is challenging for running. And I am personally experiencing that. Actually, both of us are in various capacities.
Yeah.
Personally experiencing those challenges as we do every year. And it's not a bad idea to pause a moment and just reflect on what it is we're doing and how that probably is similar to some of the things you all are trying to figure out. And so here I am personally preparing for spring races. I don't have anything immediate on the calendar, although there may be a race now in March that has yet to be determined exactly, and so I will not specifically announce anything, but there may be a race in March, and if not, certainly some in April, late April and May, and so still time yet. But the winter is difficult because you're starting to want to build the training base if it's not already built, and yet we find ourselves trying to figure out how to train when there's suddenly a foot of snow on the ground in the morning, when there's suddenly slush and ice. So a good example is Monday of the week when we are publishing this, depending on when you're listening to it. Monday, I was going to go out for a run after work, and the day was quite nice. It was a clear day. There was not fresh snow on the ground, and so roads were fairly clear, and it wasn't all that cold. Somewhere in the 30s, which isn't bad. And so I thought, oh, great. I'm going to be able to run a steady effort today because Mondays are one of the days of the week that I like to run steady efforts, which is wonderful. And so I am finishing up work for the day and head upstairs out of my home office to start getting ready for the run, and suddenly look out the window and discover it has been snowing. In sometime in the last hour or so. I only just got home. It wouldn't have even been an hour. I only just got home, and it was snowing enough that it was like blizzard almost conditions. And I thought, oh, great. Here goes my great conditions for a steady effort, because as you well know, it's hard to run higher efforts when the footing is poor. As a matter of fact, I don't even advise it ever. So what I did, my strategy was I threw on my trail shoes, which I actually just recently acquired. Shout out to Rockford Footwear Depot, which is a Saucony brand, or rather has the Saucony brand, because it's part of the company that owns Saucony. But so I'm putting on these new shoes because I just discovered that the training shoe that I like to run in the most, my daily trainer, which is the Saucony Ride, has a new trail shoe that is the Saucony Ride with a trail bottom. It's like the same shoe with a trail bottom. That's awesome. More companies should do that. So I tried those out and thought, okay, you can run higher efforts on less great footing if you're wearing trail shoes, but it still wasn't great. And part of the reason why it still wasn't great is because it was still blizzarding essentially the entire run. And this is how I know that it was significant. I was running a 2-mile loop that I like to do for these types of things because usually the road is fairly clear in the winter. It wasn't this time because, how. But I was running this 2-mile loop, and every time I'd go around, I should be running on like basically my old footprints. They were almost completely gone. It was snowing that much. So there you have it. That's more than you needed to know about Zach's steady run the other day. But that's essentially what we cope with. And so you wake up one morning and you think, I was going to do this today, but instead I'm just going to have to jog on my treadmill because that's what the weather gave me today.
I got to run outside, and I was just happy to be outside because I haven't been outside in a long time. Like, in that capacity, I've been outside with my kids and sledding and things like that. But I was actually able to run outside, and that just made me happy. Helped my mood.
I was so excited for you that I just knocked my microphone.
Yeah, that's about it.
That's awesome.
That's all I got.
That's awesome. That is massively exciting, and you should be very excited with us.
I am.
For Andy.
Oh, thanks.
I'm talking to them.
Oh, okay. Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, we've got plenty of more exciting things coming as the season begins to unfold. But for now, let's go ahead and get started with our next conversation about motivation. If you listened to the previous episode, then you know that we are in the midst of a kind of mini series right now discussing what it looks like to get started or restarted. And so whether you're new to running or you're coming back from something, a break, an injury, a disruption of some reason or rationale or another. And so when we're trying to reform or form new habits, what are some of the experiences we encounter? And that's what we're discussing. Last week we talked about the first priority, what you should do. And if you don't know what the first priority is, go and listen to the previous episode and you'll learn it all. But also, it's movement. And there you have it. And teaching ourselves to move properly and just doing something, just getting started by doing something. That's very important. And so this week now we're going to address the next step in that process. Natural next step in our minds is, what about when I don't want to do it anymore? Which we are told happens pretty early in the process of any kind of new thing. When it's no longer quite as novel and exciting, and it hurts. So what do? We're going to talk about motivation. But first, I thought, you know what? We're not the only ones who have talked about this topic. And so why don't I just encounter on the interwebs some other ideas and such, just to get a sense of what other publications have addressed within the topic. And so I found on Runner's World, they posted on the first of the year, which is great timing for any kind of how to start running post, which is what their thing is called. But then it was behind a paywall. And so I don't know what Runner's World has to say about.
You weren't willing to pay it.
No.
But here we are. You get this for free. So
you get this.
I'm glad that we can
and we are
offer that.
Confident that this will be helpful to you, regardless of your degree of experience in the thing we all call running. So let's talk about motivation. Which is the easy part, right? Like, this is a new thing. I'm excited to do it. Why would it ever be difficult for me to stay motivated?
Well, there's a lot of obstacles, I think.
Yeah.
For many of us, I think running, because it's hard, there is the barrier of, well, it's just a difficult thing to do.
You're asking much of your physiology. Yeah. Yeah, and what it comes down to is, it doesn't really matter what the it is. Behavior change is difficult for humans. Probably for anything, and probably even more so for other creatures actually, but for humans in particular, it's very difficult because of both layers. And we want to talk about and address both things, I'm going to say the word both too many times today, in terms of the challenge as well as the solution. And so in behavior change and the difficulties that we find therein, we have an unconscious element and a conscious element. And we're going to address both of those as we now go through the rest of the topic here. But the unconscious motivations or unconscious obstacles are fairly straightforward. And I think at this point in history now, fairly well addressed. And so in terms of psychological and in terms of neuroscience and all of that, we are very well aware of these realities. And as a matter of fact, we have sensationalized one aspect of it with the New Year's resolution thing by calling it Quitter's Day, which I don't love. Like, so here's the problem. This is the problem with doing this, all right? Society, let me tell you about your problems. That's so presumptuous. Don't hate me because I make these kinds of statements. By giving it a name, and this is a true thing, by giving it a name, you guarantee more people are going to do it. Guarantee it. Because now you have created a thing around Quitter's Day. And some will say, but it also makes people like, rise to the challenge. Well, I won't quit on Quitter's Day. Right, but now they're all thinking about quitting. And what you do is you create a self-fulfilling prophecy. We have known about this for decades, centuries even, in humanity, that this is a bad practice, and yet we just can't help ourselves. So Quitter's Day.
But also naming things and not stepping out of denial is a way to overcome. So I understand.
No, that's not what I'm saying, though.
Like the day itself, or
yeah. So like by saying there's like a thing that we quit, like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about saying this particular day is Quitter's Day.
Gotcha, yeah.
That's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, you're right. There's a multiple. This is a complex thing.
It is.
And so when we talk about the neuroscience behind behavior change, we know that the phrase "we are creatures of habit" is a literal scientific reality. Like our brains form pathways. Neural pathways, and then don't want to deviate from those neural pathways. And so as it goes, the actual electrical signals in your head want to go the same direction every time. They want to go to that same place every time. And so then when I am not thinking, when I'm unconsciously doing the things, I tend toward whatever is established. I tend toward my habits, which means when you're trying to do something new, it is an actual cognitive challenge. And the unconscious part of it is less likely to actually do it without intervention. This is very frustrating. You have to do something. Energy. Yes, you have to do something to make it happen. It won't just happen by itself. The thing you don't want will continue to happen by itself. So that's a problem. But that's only one part of the problem.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, sorry. Well, I just thought you were going to just take it and run. Well, the other part of the problem is the conscious part of the problem.
I didn't know you were leading me there.
Sorry.
I thought you
were.
I didn't know you were done with that part. Yeah. So there's also conscious obstacles. And to begin, sometimes many of us have a hard time to just start. And there's a paralysis that happens. And so oftentimes we'll have like unrealistic expectations of what things should be like in this moment, and that keeps us from entering in because we have high hopes and we're kind of afraid of those high hopes. And then there's also a danger of apathy, like when we start, okay, so we start now, but it's not what we expected and it's moving much slower. Sometimes we become apathetic and we just are like, that's when we quit. We're just like, okay, well, it's too challenging.
I don't care.
I don't care. Yeah. And then there's complacency, which is a little different because it's like, it's fine. Whatever I'm doing, it's fine. And I don't really need to challenge myself. Whatever happens. And it's kind of in that no man's land. It's not consistent. It's whenever we feel like it, which does not turn into good, consistent fitness building. And then there's the danger of perfectionism, which is I have to get everything perfect. And so that makes me afraid. And I just don't think I can be perfect. So I'm just not going to do it at all.
Yeah. And keep in mind this moment in time when you're starting something new or restarting something, it's almost never going to be perfect. It not almost never, obviously will never be perfect, but more to the point, you're going to have obstacles and you're going to hit bumps along the road. You should plan for that. You should expect that. And yet, in that moment, the desire to have things exactly the way they should be makes it very hard to stay motivated when they're not.
And part of that can be comparing to what we've done before, if this is a restart for us, or it's just things will come easier. Let's say you picked up an instrument and it wasn't so hard to progress, or it could be any number of things, but our expectation because of our past can keep us from having a good movement forward and consistency. We can compare ourselves to what we used to do. We can also just, as we're thinking about it, think about what we would want for ourselves. So like it might be our past self. Okay, when I'm trained for a marathon, this is what it's going to be like. So we kind of imagine, and that false sense of reality gets in our way and as a hindrance to us moving to the present and then thinking about the future with clarity. So it's good to have an honest evaluation of what you've done before that's worked, but to come to that our present moment and then start thinking about what we can do productively instead of lingering in that past or in that imaginary state of what we thought it might be.
So this is a good transition because Andy's intimating some of the things that we should do to prevent these challenges, such as they are. So let's continue along that path, because in these two broad layers, unconscious and conscious obstacles, there are certain types of interventions, strategies we can employ that are going to make these things much less likely to derail us. They're still going to happen. The challenges are still going to be present, but they don't have to stop us from achieving what we've set out to do here. So let's talk about some of those. We're going to go back to the unconscious now for a moment. In some ways, this is more straightforward than the conscious side of the obstacles, because the unconscious has a lot to do with just hacking how our brains work with some simple strategies. And the main principle of these simple strategies is try to make the thing you want, the behavior change, try to make it automatic, make it routine. And so in order to do that, we can employ some of these thoughts, like, for instance, removing choice. The fewer choices you have to make, conscious decisions, the more likely it is you're going to do the thing. And so ways to achieve that, plan it out in advance. Like, look at your week and say, this is when I'm going to run. This is when I'm going to wake up. This is how I'm going to do this thing. And plan out all the details. Look at the weather ahead of time and say, there's a good chance it's going to be snowing Thursday and Friday, so if it's not on Wednesday, I'm going to do this certain thing Wednesday so that on Thursday and Friday when I have to be indoors, here are my options. Like things like that, right? So do that, plan those things out, and then share that plan with the people who it affects, because this is one of the big challenges is we plan these things, but then someone else has a different vision for what this day is going to look like, and we didn't share those thoughts with each other ahead of time. I may or may not be confessing something on air at the moment, but what happens in that moment is someone's vision gets broken, and usually in a healthy scenario we can just come to an agreement together about what's the best thing to do. But either way, it causes at least a moment of tension, if not, for some of us here, substantial conflict at times. So plan it out, communicate that plan with the people it's going to affect, because then it's going to happen. When we're all in agreement and we're headed in the same direction, we can make it happen. And that's a really good place to be. So that speaks to this next hack or strategy here, which is just accountability, external accountability. Make sure somebody else knows what you're doing. Now, I have spoken with many of you, both runners we have ourselves directly coached and others just runners that we've talked with about this topic. And so many times, and I love it, is you say, I'm doing my first 5K, or I'm getting back into shape to do this next goal with my friend. We're doing it together. We have started together. We have committed to, here's when we're going to meet up, or here's when we're going to talk to each other about it. Like you just know instinctively. What?
Well, it's so fun because my mom and my aunt, it's actually my mom's sister-in-law, but for many years, as long as I can remember, they've run together. And I was just talking to them. I ran my first outdoor run with them. And I had said something to the effect of like, you guys have just been runners for so long and been so fit for so long. And they're like, well, we have each other. And I don't think I would have run yesterday except for that Aunt Priscilla agreed to meet me to run. And so this is just a great illustration. It's not just like for a single season, but lifelong relationships that you can call each other up and keep each other accountable by scheduling times to run together. I think it's just really cool.
It is indeed, which is why there's a kind of sweet spot, a kind of Goldilocks zone in terms of doing something like this with a group, where if it's too many people, and I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to have a huge group of runners that meet together, but you have a kind of anonymity in large groups. And if it's too few people, then when someone can't make it, it's really hard for you to be motivated because it's like, oh, my one friend that I was going to run with can't on that Tuesday we normally run together, and now I really don't want to run on Tuesday anymore because I just don't want to do it by myself. So if you have like 3 or 4, then, that helps. So I say that only because there are so many stories of success where runners will say, I am a runner. Like, it's a part of who I am because every Tuesday and Thursday morning I met with this group of like 5 to 8 people for 10 years. And yeah, sometimes come and go. Someone moved away. Someone else joined the group. Some people couldn't be there for 3 or 4 months. Someone got injured for a while, but we still continued the thing. And I have heard that story so many times, and it makes me joyful. It's good. But here's the thing. When we're talking about unconscious motivation, accountability is good, but there's a kind of accountability that has proven to be very effective, which is, and it doesn't sound pleasant, but it is coercive external accountability. As a matter of fact, the phrase I'm going to use is voluntary coercive external motivation. Coin that phrase if you'd like. And here's what we mean by this, which is for me to willingly say, I'm going to put myself in a situation where it would be undesirable for me to violate the agreement. Okay? I'm going to put myself in a situation where something unpleasant, I would experience something unpleasant if I violate the agreement. And here's an example, and I love this. This was like perfect timing. Comes to us from Paul. Shout out to Paul. He shared with me after the previous episode. He said, hey, you're talking about motivation next, because we said we would. And he said, I just read this book that has some ideas that connect very closely with some of the things you're talking about, and I just wanted to share it with you. And I have not read this book myself, and now I think I'm going to. The book is called The 4 Tendencies, by the way, and it's a kind of like behavioral analysis type of approach to thinking about our tendencies. And the authors break down these 4 different kinds of things categories we tend to fall in. And they're very simple. And it has to do with external and internal motivations or obligations, you could say. And so there's a type, one of the 4, that's called the obliger. The obliger is the one who is externally motivated, but not as much internally. So they're doing things for other people or because other people need them, right? But not necessarily because they want to. And then when it comes down to like their own things, it's hard for them to be motivated because no one else is saying, I want you to do this. A strategy shared, Paul gave me this example when he was sharing this, was you take your friend and you go to the gym together. And then when you leave the gym that day, you swap shoes and say, like your gym shoes, and say, tomorrow we have to meet back at the gym. Because I don't get my shoes back.
It's so weird.
But that's a great example of voluntary coercive external motivation. You're making a situation, even though you want to do that thing anyway, and you are probably going to, you're creating a context when you wake up that next morning, you're like, wow, I'm really tired. Or better yet, this is a better example, when you're getting ready for that night before the next morning, and you're thinking, I'm going to watch another episode, or I'm going to eat another snack and stay up a little while later for that to digest all the way, you're going to tell yourself, oh, but I'm definitely meeting for that run tomorrow morning because I don't have my shoes unless I do, so I should just go to bed right now. That's what voluntary coercive external motivation does, is it creates a kind of need that you can't deny. You can't say, just not today. That's not a bad strategy at the early stages. Now, we have learned in terms of external motivation that this type of strategy tends to not be an effective long-term approach. But in the early days, when you're trying, remember, we're talking about unconscious obstacles here. When you're trying to create an automatic or new neural pathway, this kind of strategy can be very helpful. So there you go. That's some strategy for unconscious motivation. But what about conscious motivation?
Yeah. So conscious motivation, as it pertains to what we just talked about in the other section when we were talking about paralysis and what keeps us from being motivated and some of those hurdles that we have mentally, this is going to help us overcome it by thinking through our process goals and having it be maybe less about performance goals early on, because we are early on. There's no way to set your performance goal when you don't know where you're going to end up at the end of the season, right?
We talk about that so much, that difference, and I just always like to inject because it demonstrates this is not our idea. Remember 4 disciplines for execution, and Franklin Covey's group is not the only ones to write about the concept. But the difference between a lead and a lag is what happens as a result of your actions. Lead is what you do that will produce the lag. Performance goals happen as a result of your training. And I understand in principle the idea of having this goal that you want to try to achieve to help motivate you. I grasp that. I'm not denying that reality. But performance as a metric is the result of the thing you're doing. So set goals around the thing you do that will produce those performance gains. And that's what Andy means when she says process goals.
Mm-hmm. And particularly when you're starting or restarting, we really can't be focused on a specific time goal because, like I mentioned, you can't know what your building will produce. You just want to be as efficient in your fitness building as possible. And so then that helps with the process goals. But speaking of which, it's very important to have good self-talk from day one. We talked about last week how we want neuromuscularity. We want our bodies to move right. We want the brain-body connection to be set early so that we run better. Well, we also want to set early how we're going to talk to ourselves and train ourselves to do it well. And I know that seems like maybe a silly thing, but self-talk is a lot of running. And if you are a distance runner or have been a distance runner, and if you're going to be a distance runner, you're going to find out real soon that you have a lot of self-talk that goes on. In races in particular, when it's a long race, you're going to have to be able to speak to yourself in a way that gets the best out of your work. So start that now. What is the story you're telling yourself about yourself? And what is this thing that you're doing and how does it benefit you? So reframing things, capturing your negative thoughts. For instance, when you're starting out, you might think, I'm slow. I feel terrible. Well, reframe that. I am challenging myself today, and I'm going to get some adaptation, man. Like today, I'm feeling it, but you know what? I'm putting this work in. So reframing, capturing your thoughts and reframing that negativity into something positive that keeps you motivated to continue your run.
And this is one of those topics that, in general, it just feels like taboo to say things like, you know, focus on positive. Like how many self-help books have been written in the last 70 years that basically just can be summarized with think positively? And the answer is all of them, all the self-help books. It was actually Andy's dad once giving me relationship advice that mentioned when he mentioned the Gottman Institute, which is famously relationship advice on lots of different aspects. And they talk about, or they write about, positivity overload, which feels taboo. But that principle, Andy said it, that principle of it's a narrative. We are telling ourselves the story about the thing we're living out in the moment. Right? You're constantly doing that. Some people do it more consciously than others, by the way. I'm the personality type who I'm literally telling myself a story. Like I'm actually building a world in my head around the moment that's happening. It's very entertaining to myself, which is part of the reason why I laugh when no one thinks anything's funny that's happening. But whatever the case may be, we're all doing it to some degree. And it is not taboo to say that however you orient that story, you're more likely to realize the outcome that you are telling. And that's not to suggest I'm not necessarily subscribing to, nor do I at all condone the idea that you can manifest whatever reality by willing it enough, because that's a little bit absurd. But there's some degree of that within our own heads that is happening all the time, which is to say you're creating a pattern of thought. So it goes back to the neuroplasticity we were discussing earlier with the pathways. You're creating a pattern of thought. And if the pattern of thought is negative, the more negative the consistent pattern of thought, the more likely you're going to stay negative. And it's very hard to break out of that. So we have to tell ourselves a better story about the thing we're doing. And I'm literal when I say tell yourself the story. Yes, this is hard. But why is it hard? Well, because you're trying to do something that is actually breaking your body down for now. But because it's hard, you know it will make you stronger. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a great story to tell yourself. And then just understand there's a degree of hard that's okay, and there's a degree of hard that's too much. We're talking about that next week, so we don't want to jump the gun. But that's good, Andy.
I really am glad that you mentioned that you tell yourself the correct story, though, because I do think a part that needs to be further discussed is that we aren't creating an imaginary positive world. We are giving ourselves realistic expectations. We are telling ourselves the truth, but we are framing it in a way that is productive and positive. And you, talking to yourself, knows your crap. So, like, if you're telling yourself things that aren't true, you're going to call yourself out on that and you're not going to be as motivated. So you do have to tell yourself the truth. And as I said, there is always something in your run that you can reframe to a better end to help you for the next day, or decisions that you can make in the future. Even if you, like, you know, pull your hamstring, for instance, there are things that I can tell myself that will be productive and helpful and eventually positive.
You were saying earlier this honest evaluation of your past, but really we're talking about an honest evaluation of your present as well.
True.
In that sense, I have to just interject this because it was such a moving aspect to me of this novel series. So we recently finished reading with our sons the books, the Aragon books. There's a whole bunch of them, written by Christopher Paolini. So they're dragons, magic, all that kind of stuff. It's great. It's wonderful. But there's this concept in the book that I just feel like is rich and so deep, and it's hard to unpack, especially with 6 and 8-year-old kids. And so they have this idea of your true name. The characters have their true name, and when they utter their true name, it like has this deeply resonant quality to it, like they feel the world kind of vibrating in a sense. It's very strange. But the point is, in order to do this, in order to actually know what your true name is, you have to know the extent of yourself, good and bad, and you have to be willing to speak it. And one of the characters will do this every day. He'll think about his true name and he'll speak it aloud. And he grapples throughout the story with the fact that he hates some aspects of himself. Like, there's some realities that are very undesirable and unpleasant, but he still refuses to ignore them because otherwise he would not know who he truly is. And I think this is the same thing we're speaking about here, which is I can't know the true story if I'm not willing to acknowledge all of it, the difficulties, the goods, the bads, the highs, the lows. But I can tell that story in its proper place, which is not a hopeless story. And so how do I find the positive story despite the full extent of reality? That's really deep. What did you think when you started the podcast today? We're going all the way down. What did we miss? So one other thing about conscious motivation, which is accountability.
Oh, yeah. Accountability.
Also accountability.
Yeah.
However, I would say that there's a different kind of accountability here that we want to speak to. So if the kind of coercive type of accountability can help us to move from unconscious to more conscious motivation, the type of accountability that we want to make sure we have present that also is going to be necessary is the supportive, encouraging, and yes, you guessed it, positive kind of accountability. And here's what I mean. You have your running partner and you have committed to this goal and you're both doing it. You're doing it together. But you and your running partner both happen to be Zach-like pessimists. And you find yourselves constantly commiserating about how miserable you are. That's redundant, but it's true. How miserable you are doing this thing. The weather's so bad, but we got to do it. We got to do it. Well, the problem is that while you are still helping each other by saying we have to do it and you're making it happen, you're also creating a constant pattern of negative thought. So do not commiserate as a default feature of your accountability. It's not to say that you can't have some fun being...
You can commiserate some, but it's not the building blocks.
No,
if it's like the groups that say, and I know it's kind of a joke, but I really don't like the premise of it, that I hate running groups. There's groups that like, that's their whole thing is that they all hate running, but they like run anyway. But I don't, it's supposed to be funny, but I don't like it as a premise.
No, I think it's actually a toxic premise.
Yeah.
It's a fun joke, but it's a toxic state of existence.
Yeah.
And so that's where you get into like the I hate running all over my shirts. And it's like, it's all fun and goofy and such. But at the same time, is that really the kind of persona you want to espouse as you indulge in this challenging task? I don't know. Anyway, there's layers to this because people are motivated in different ways.
It's true.
And so you may actually be better motivated by someone in your face yelling at you the whole time. That is a fact.
So I do want to mention one other thing for the accountability that's not a person, but it's signing up for a race. I do think that it is helpful to look far enough in advance to help you have some sort of motivation sign up for a race. However, financial stake, something's on the calendar. You want to be prepared for that distance at that time. But I would caution that many people will sign up for races too soon when they're starting and restarting, or something that maybe is too big.
I've never run before and I want to run a marathon in 8 weeks. I got it. Andy told me to do it, so I did.
No, so you want to give yourself a proper amount of time to do it correctly, but it gives you the proper amount of motivation because something's on the calendar. So it's a sweet spot there.
Right, and I think in principle, that's a hard decision to make unless you're already privy to what it's going to take to get from where you are now to when you'd be ready. But the other layer of that is you don't have to be perfectly ready. Go back to the perfection thing before. Like, you can run a race without being ready in all senses of the term. The main thing is you need to be able to physiologically handle at least the distance. So if you can do that, like I'm not super fit right now, but I could go run a half marathon right now and it would not be a problem. I would not run it hard the whole time necessarily. But that's the principle. Like, put something on the calendar, and even if you get to that race and you're not truly like in your most ready state, you can still do the thing. We talk a whole lot about this podcast. On this podcast, we talk a whole lot about what it means to race in general, that it is not all about only running your very best performance of your life every time you race. So there's a lot to that, but I think that's a great example. Thank you, Andy. Mm-hmm. So let's wrap it up. What we've got here is we've got motivation, and it's just not going to be easy. And that's really kind of the point, which is to say that this is one of the most predictable parts about any kind of new thing, which is to say, I think I just said that twice, that we will experience waning motivation. It is a guarantee. The question is only when, and it's probably going to be soon is the answer. Because in behavior change, the motivational period is fairly brief before it starts declining. And so then we just have to employ these strategies, and we're going to be able to combat that effectively. Many, many people have. You're not going to be the first. You will not be the last. So just know that you're in good company as you're facing the challenge. Plan for it. Make it a routine. Set process goals and enjoy them. Find joy in those incremental steps. That positive self-talk, or we could say the positive story that we're telling ourselves, and the right kinds of accountability at the right times and places. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine.
And learn to love running to actually enjoy the thing as much as you can. Not every day is going to be peaches and roses and sunshine. We definitely know that there's not going to be sunshine every day, especially those of us that live in Michigan. But learn to just like to run and try to like to run. So put yourself in situations that will help you enjoy it more, so that just going out and doing the thing gives to your life instead of takes from it.
Which is a great segue, because next week we're going to talk about why you're experiencing discomfort, fatigue, pain, soreness, all those things, and what you should be doing in response to that, or potentially proactively about it. So when the difficult parts come, we know there are things that can help. And we'll talk about it next week. So let's go ahead and hit a good pause on the topic for now, before that comes around next time, so that we can move on to the latest news and updates from the world of running. No A2Z Runner updates this week. It was a quiet weekend for the crew, which is normal this time of year. We tend to have some quiet weekends, but there's excitement coming, even in February, such as it were. So stay tuned. More from the group later.
Well, kicking things off, indoor meet, Dr. Sanders meet is kind of like a prelude to the Millrose Games.
Yeah, it actually was like a Millrose Games trials. I forgot about that.
Yeah. Well, the winners of the Pro Elite fields, that's what they called it, Pro Elite, were guaranteed a spot.
In the invitational section. Yeah, that's actually premier, because it's an indoor meet at Millrose Games, and so they have fewer runners in each section. And the fastest heats of the distance events, the invitational heats, are just that. They're invitational only. You're only getting into that heat if you are world class. But at Dr. Sanders, if you won your heat, it doesn't matter who was in it. If you won your heat from the pro invite sections, you got a free entry. Well, not free. I don't know how that works, but you got an entry into the
guaranteed
fast
spot.
Heats. Yeah, It's pretty cool. Pretty cool.
And it's pretty star-studded, though, guys. Millrose Games. Keep your eye out for it, because it's going to be cool.
Coming soon.
Well, let's talk about Caitlin Toohey. We enjoy talking about Caitlin Toohey. She's done a lot of cool things. She made her season debut running 4:25, which is just a shade under her personal best time in the indoor mile.
Yeah, about a second. This is significant for a number of reasons, but not least of which is technically last year was Toohey's debut pro season, but she was hurt. And I don't know exactly the extent of the injury or when, but she did do some racing. It wasn't great. And that was, a lot of people said, well, wait till she has a healthy start and then call it like her pro debut. But you can't do that. She did still have her pro debut last year. However, she has demonstrated already in her very first race in months that, yeah, she's going to be there. She's going to be in it. So keep your eyes on Toohey, because now that she's on the pro scene and healthy, presumably, good things coming.
She did all the work, too, for this heat. There were some rabbits, but, as they drop off at 800, it was Caitlin Toohey, and she did have a challenger, a collegian that was challenging, but from behind. So not terribly helpful in helping Toohey, except for that she probably ran like she was being chased.
I mean,
but it's not quite as helpful as being the one who's chasing or having someone that switches the lead with you. But great work to Toohey for handling that mentally. So that was great.
It was. Well, speaking of great, Cam Myers, the sensational Australian Ute, who is still a teenager. We feel like we've been talking about it because we have been talking about him for years. Cam Myers is just continuing to set records. So he ran the mile in this event. And remember what we were talking about. You win your heat and you get a ticket to Millrose Games. At 19 years of age, actually, is he 19 yet? He might have just turned 19. Either way, he does not turn 20 in the year 2025. So at 18 or 19 years of age, Cam Myers won the race in 3:53 for the full mile, which marked, yes, an indoor personal best. Actually, that was his first time ever running on an indoor track.
Yeah, he said in the post-race
Racing,
interview that he didn't even do a workout on an indoor track.
Yeah, this was very unfamiliar.
First time on an indoor track, and what did he do, Zach? What's
Welcome
the big news?
aboard. He ran the world under 20 record for the short track mile. And just understanding the difference between short track and long track, if you're running indoors versus outdoors, most of the time the short tracks have a banked curve as well. And so that is weird for runners who have never done that before. Cam Myers, no sweat. It was easy peasy for him. He just executed a perfect race, ran 3:53. It is a world under 20 short track record. By the way, he also holds the Oceania under 20 outdoor mile record in 3:50. 3:50, which he ran at the pre-classic last year, a year ago, when he was like 17. I mean, this kid, crazy.
And because he ran that fast last year, that is likely why he was very unenthused about his performance.
Weird.
Like, hey, congratulations on a world record. And he's like,
It was almost like he was kind of like, oh, cool.
He didn't seem surprised. He's just like, I wanted to run fast.
We have to remember, Andy, he's a teenager.
Yeah.
And he's got his rep to worry about. And he's got his coolness to worry about.
Maybe that's what that was.
And if you're
not like
cool,
apathy to me.
Yeah, it really did. Even like in the race, he crossed the line and it was just kind of like,
Yeah.
He just like looked around and he was like, okay. Which part of me said, could you have run a little faster maybe?
I have to say, though, as I have observed many, many years of indoor track and outdoor track, I think in indoor, people are just overall, it's like the indoor track sucks the life out of them. And at the end of their races, they like look dead, like real dead. At outdoor, they like lay on the ground, but they're like expressing themselves usually when they've
Pros
done
don't
well.
usually lay on the ground.
I'm just saying. Like when they're excited and they're like,
yeah.
I don't know, they get on their knees to thank God or they hug people. I don't know. It just looks different in outdoor track than indoor track. Indoor track, it's like they can't breathe. It's like sterile in there. I don't know.
It is not the same. There's no doubt about it. Also, the stadium for the Armory has very little seating. So, like, there's not a lot of energy in there. It's just an unfortunate reality to the Armory. It's like they redid the facility. It's like, could you put more seating somehow? Because, 400 people watching a track meet just feels like sparse. But that may contribute. Who knows? The point is, it was kind of weird, but also he ran super fast.
We were impressed. We were excited for him.
And
we were more excited than he was.
Yes, you should know. Understanding historical context here, indoor track and field, or what they now call short track, because I don't know why World Athletics decided to stop calling it indoors. Well, I do know why, because indoors can refer to any size track still. There's all sorts of different sizes of tracks. So now they have an actual tier called short track for records, and that specifies the
not a short
nature.
Distance,
no.
A short oval.
Yeah, the track is 200 meters instead of the traditional 400 meters, and so it's twice as many laps to cover the same distance, which feels really weird when you're doing it. Like a 5K is really long on a 200-meter track. But anyway, the reason I say this is because it's not, as a sport, the indoor side of track and field is not as well developed historically, and it only was recent in the last couple iterations of Olympic cycles that there even started to be high-caliber indoor track meets outside of the United States. There just weren't any anywhere else, hardly. And so we don't have a lot of the top-tier world-class teenage runners doing things like indoor track. They just don't, which is the nature of the thing. So Cam Myers gets the record then, because he did for his first time. All right. That's exciting. Let's do this. Let's talk about Shelby Houlihan for a moment. She's in the news a lot right now, and I mentioned a little bit about this last week, but now an interview was released between Houlihan and DieStats Keenan, and it was interesting. I listened to the whole thing.
Did you? Wow.
I did.
So to give you some history for those that are just joining us, Shelby Houlihan held American records.
Still holds
the
1,500 meter.
15, yeah.
Yep.
And was banned for illegal substance in her system. She says she's innocent, that she did not ingest on purpose this thing. that she got banned for.
Yeah.
But she served a 4-year ban because there was enough of a level that the report said it was undeniable that it was ingested on purpose.
That's what they say.
That's what they said from what I read. But everyone in her circles believes she's innocent, and she says she's innocent, and even... Well, I'll let you continue with this.
Yeah, well, there's layers of challenge to this kind of thing because here's what you have. You have the World Anti-Doping Agency. Well, it's the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, actually, who handled the case. But you have the Anti-Doping Agency, or the Athletics Integrity Unit, who is saying there's no way that this was not deliberate cheating. And yet there's nothing to corroborate that except the test. And I say that because she has denied it since day one. There has never been another person who has said, she might have cheated. Not a single one. And all testimony was in her favor as far as from other people.
Like character testimony.
Character testimony, teammates, coaches, anyone else involved. They're like, there's no way. She just did not do that. Also, the substance that she showed positive is not something athletes use like ever. It's just not a substance that you see anyone trying to get away with. So that's obscure and strange. Yes, it's true. It's on the banned substance list. It's true. It's tied to performance enhancement. She did not have terribly high levels, and so
but enough that they're saying it wasn't accidental.
Well, they're saying that you couldn't have gotten that much from. She said she ate bad meat from a fruit truck. And it is true that this substance is naturally found in pork, which is why she's like, I had pork tacos.
It was like pork, specifically like pork liver or something like that.
But pork tacos from a food truck can have anything in them. You never know, right? That's her claim. And so everyone who is sympathetic finds Shelby's claims to be believable, but also finds the proof against her to be narrow. Like there's only one thing, which is the test. And not only that, but in the interview she talked about the process following the test, and it's like she actually did a polygraph, did a lie detector test, which she passed, and it was like 3 days after her drug test came back. So it's not like, it's not like 2 months later and she like somehow prepared for it, which I don't know. So polygraph tests, people say all sorts of stuff, but the truth is it is hard to pass a polygraph test if you are consciously lying. It is not easy to do. Now, the other side of this is we also know that false positive testing does happen. And so they have layers to this where they can to try to test multiple samples, to test multiple times. And the reality is, in theory, it's possible for someone to have false positives. It's also possible for a test to get corrupted. And so you look at this and you say the potential for things to have happened that make this test not the only source of evidence, and they have no other evidence whatsoever, it makes people want to believe Houlihan, which is why I say there's a lot of sympathy in her court. Most of the time, even with people who deny to the bitter end their positive test results, most of the time there's other things that say, this looks like it probably was still shady, and yet we don't see a lot of that here. So in any event, she was talking about that, but it was what I want to reflect on here is the nature of who Shelby Houlihan was during this interview, because I have never seen anything like this. She consistently was talking about, I didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. I didn't want to upset my teammates. I was worried that if I stayed in close contact with people that they would be nervous about like being sought as guilty. Like, I never once heard Shelby Houlihan say things like, woe is me, I'm the victim here. And that astounds me because she lost 2 Olympic cycles, 4 years of competitive running, and all the income. She was doing DoorDash and cat sitting to make enough money. She rented her house out and lived out of her car, driving around the country to stay with family members so that she could still train and pursue her dream. And I'm looking at all this and I'm saying, you have a serious case for what I would find intolerable, but she could, for the woe is me, they ruined my life kind of thing. And she did none of that. She did say she was furious. She did say she absolutely thinks that the whole process treated her poorly. But that was it. She said that, moved on. And I was impressed. That was really interesting. Like the character demonstrated in this interview, and yes, it could have been an act. It's true. But, I mean, she's being interviewed on Die-Stat. It's not like the whole world's going to see this interview. I just think that, a couple of quotes really demonstrate it. She was asked by the interviewer, like, are you upset about that? Like, how do you feel about this now? And she said, I served the time. What is there left to say? Like, people are going to hate on me. People are going to... He actually specifically said, what if they boo you when you come out on the track this weekend? She's running her first race back here in a couple of days. What if they boo you when you come out on the track? Like, that's got to be hard. And she's like, I did the punishment. There's nothing left to say. I'm moving on, and they can move on or not. I can't do anything about that. I'm going to go out and I'm going to run. And I was just like, holy smokes. The other side of this is like, she might come out here and just obliterate everyone and just like storm through the circuit.
She could.
She might do that, and it would just be crazy if she did. Yeah, it was really something. That's about all I want to say. I'm looking at the page here. I have all
some of the
these
things
notes,
that she's gonna do moving forward to help her to prove her innocence if ever she has a failed test again. She doesn't take any more vitamins and supplements. She'll freeze meat that she eats just in case she gets tested or fails a test, just to see like if that was it. Like, she's going to do everything she can. She wants to do everything possible to continue on in this sport that she loves. I can't imagine the paranoia that you'd have.
Yeah.
If she indeed is innocent, she would feel paranoid every time she's tested, I'm sure.
Yep. It's crazy. Yeah, there's a lot of discussing some of that kind of stuff. So the final thing, which is a good lesson for all of us now, a good takeaway in general, the interviewer asked her, what are your expectations for this first race back and these first couple of outings? Because she's running... Apparently, she's committed to both. She's running a super low-key race for her first race back. And then the next week, she's doing the Boston mile, the BU mile, which is a fast one. That's a competitive race. And so he asked her about her expectations. She said, when you have expectations, this is a quote, when you have expectations about how things should go and it doesn't, you just end up frustrated. It's like, oh, mismatch theory.
Yeah.
She's got it. And so I thought that was great. That's great advice. And so her point was, I have hopes, but I don't know what to expect here. It's been 4 years since her last sanctioned competition. 4 years. The last time she ran a race officially, like an official race, was in the year 2020.
I feel that.
Whoa. You do.
Poor Shelby.
You do.
I can kind of commiserate with you, but not at the same time.
Yeah.
In just a couple ways.
Yeah. So
Oh.
we don't know, and no one does. We don't know for sure.
But it's true that she paid the punishment. So if
Right.
she was guilty, she paid her punishment. She paid it hard. If she didn't do it, oh man, you better watch out. That woman's gonna have a fire inside of her, in her belly.
Whatever the case may be, I certainly am always willing to give people the benefit of the doubt when it's easy to do so, and we do wish her the best here at this point in time. We certainly hope that she was clean before, and if not, she better be now. that's all. That's what she was essentially saying. Better be now. But either way, it's always interesting to see how it unfolds. So we've got that coming. We're going to be sharing that with you next week. That's part of the reason why we wanted to spend some time on it now, because next week we'll be able to tell you how that first race went. Okay, final note. Creatine. What are your thoughts about creatine?
I don't have much
None.
in my thoughts because I've never taken creatine before. So
an article recently published by Run by Outside was addressing the topic yet again, and this is one of those topics that's just going to keep coming back around. What's interesting to me is they were trying to say, should distance runners use this supplement, creatine? And their conclusion was maybe. But the pros and cons, the cons were pretty loose. Like after reading through their pros and cons, I was like, that's not a maybe. That's an obvious yes. Runners should use it, but you don't have to. Like it's not a game changer. But if you're wondering, would this help me? Then the answer is yeah, it would. Oh. But just probably not a lot, and probably not in the ways you're thinking. And so here's the reality: creatine.
It's legal.
Yeah. It's been used. This is constant.
Just checking.
People are using creatine out in the open. I mean, you got these big giant shakes that say creatine on them, and people are just drinking them. Creatine is simply a type of fuel for your muscles that is already naturally there, and you can just add a little more to it. But in particular, it's a type of fuel for your muscles that helps produce ATP, which is actually the fuel for muscles, I guess, technically. But creatine, your body breaks down creatine and helps produce ATP. Creatine is the thing your body does before it starts using glucose. And so this is what happens. You have three energy systems in your body that you will use while you're running. You have the analactic, I always forget how it's called, analactic aerobic energy system, I think is how they say it. But in essence, the creatine phosphate in your body is burned first. And you naturally have stored up in your cells about 10 seconds worth of it. And then it's probably all burnt out. So at the very beginning of a race, for instance, you can feel really great for the first, burst of speed, and then after a short bit, your body turns over to the next step. And then beyond that, you have aerobic and anaerobic. And so the that's what it is, alactic anaerobic energy system. So alactic anaerobic because it's anaerobic, but it's not producing lactic byproducts. And then you have aerobic, which we know what that is. That's using oxygen. You have anaerobic, which is not using oxygen, which breaks down glucose and other things and produces ions in your blood that create a charge. And so that's where you get the lactic byproduct. So what's going to happen then is if you take creatine as a supplement, it's going to add to the amount that's already there a little bit. But there's only so much your body can store, and so you can only do so much good with a creatine supplement. It's not one of those things where it's like, if you just suck on creatine all day long, you're going to be huge. That's not how it works. But creatine does a few things for you. Not only that, it produces that burst of high energy. It gives you a little more of that. Yes, true. It also helps store water in your muscles, and so you're going to have access to a little bit more stored water, which for a distance runner, that's not always a bad thing. It by the way, it could be, though. It could be a bad thing. But if you think about like in hot weather or something like that, it could potentially be a valuable thing if you are well hydrated. That's the key, because it's storing the water more, which means it's not in circulation. And so, again, it could be a good thing and it could be a bad thing, depends on the situation. And then also, apparently creatine helps storing glucose as well. And so you're going to have access to potentially a little bit more stored glucose. They have found in studies that creatine post-workout helps with recovery a bit, probably has something to do with how it provides energy and how it helps with water and glucose storage. But it's small. It helps, but it's small. And then one of the other benefits they have found is that using creatine and exercises that are non-running exercises, like when you're injured and you can't run, can at least help maintain muscle mass a little bit better. So that's true too. Okay, so if all of those things are true, what are the cons? Well, this is why I say they're loose. The cons are like, some people feel like it causes gastrointestinal distress, which is true of like every supplement, and so that's not unique. Also, people don't like when they have a little extra water weight, so that's not great. And then the last thing is, it's another supplement, and that might be inconvenient. So that list of cons is pretty flimsy. So I look at that and I think, okay, if you're asking me, is creatine helpful for runners? The answer is yes. I don't use it. I have in the past, and I was like, meh, not worth it. Because it does not provide significant benefit for endurance running. But in training, it could be of value, in particular when you're doing your strength work for maximum muscle contraction type of work, plyometric type explosive stuff. It can be valuable for those kinds of exercises. And when you're doing things like interval training, hill repeat training, some of those kinds of things, it could also be valuable for some of that. I should mention, we didn't say this earlier, but this is one of the reasons why it matters. Creatine is replenished very quickly in your body. And so if you rest, then it comes back very quickly. So if you're doing an interval workout with 3 to 5 minutes of rest in between intervals, whether strength work or actual running, then your creatine is actually replenishing. So you can keep using creatine as a source of fuel. But again, only for like the 10 to 15 second bursts. It's not giving you much, and it's not giving you it for very long. Okay, anyway, that's creatine. And I don't think that adds anything to the understanding of creatine in the current schema, except that a friend of mine just simply mentioned it in passing the other day. And so it was on my mind when I saw it on Run's list of recent articles. I was like, oh, that is already on my mind. Let's see what they have to say about it. That's it.
Cool. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for another week talking about restarting. We're going to continue the conversation next week, so make sure you join us. Have a good week.